There are certain interactions that stay with you long after they have ended. Not because anything dramatic or obvious happened in that moment, but because something about that conversation did not sit right with you, even if you cannot immediately explain why. It might have been a comment that sounded casual, but felt slightly critical, or a conversation where you felt unheard, dismissed, or subtly judged, or even an interaction where you walked away feeling drained, confused, or questioning yourself in a way that you were not before. And what makes this even more difficult to recognize is that, in isolation, each of these moments feels small enough to ignore, something you can brush off and move past. And yet, when these interactions begin to repeat, you start to notice a pattern where your energy shifts around certain people, where you feel slightly on edge before meeting them, or where you find yourself being more careful with what you say. This is what we are going to talk about today. Because toxic people are not always obvious, and toxic behavior does not always look like conflict or aggression, especially when it shows up in subtle ways in everyday relationships. Hi, I'm Bhavna, founder of the Inspirated Life Co. And on this channel, we explore leadership, lifestyle, and personal growth through reflection and real life experience, creating space to think more clearly about how we live, work, and lead ourselves. If you reflect on what we have been exploring across these conversations, from people pleasing to the need for approval, from overthinking to self-doubt, and then into boundaries, you will begin to see how all of these patterns become more intense when you're dealing with toxic people. Because these relationships tend to amplify your internal reactions without you fully realizing it at first. Toxic people are not always loud, aggressive, or openly negative, because in many cases their behavior is subtle, consistent, and often disguised in ways that make it difficult to call out. It may look like someone who constantly criticizes you but frames it as advice, or someone who makes you feel like you are overreacting whenever you express a concern, or someone who expects your time, your attention, and your energy without really considering your boundaries. Sometimes it is the person who makes conversations about themselves, or the one who leaves you feeling guilty for saying no, or even the ones who creates confusion by saying one thing and doing another. And what makes this more complex is that these are not always people you can easily walk away from, because they may be colleagues, family members, or people you interact with regularly. Which means the impact is not occasional, it is repeated. I began to notice this more clearly in my own experience when I realized that certain interactions were consistently leaving me feeling mentally and emotionally heavier, even though there was no obvious conflict or issue in those moments. At first, it was easy to dismiss, to assume it was just a difference in personality or communication style. But over time, I started noticing a pattern where I would second guess myself after conversations, where I would replay things in my mind, or where I would adjust how I spoke in anticipation of how it might be received. There were also moments where I found myself taking responsibility for keeping the interaction smooth, even when they meant holding back what I actually wanted to say, or agreeing to things that did not feel right in the moment. And that is often how toxic dynamics affect you. Not in one big moment, but in small, repeated interactions that slowly influence how you think, how you respond, and how you see yourself. One of the most common things people do in these situations is adjust themselves rather than question the dynamic, because it feels easier to be more accommodating, more patient, or more understanding than it does to address something that might create discomfort. But over time, that adjustment comes at a cost, because you are constantly managing someone else's behavior while moving further away from your own clarity. It is also important to say that not every difficult person is toxic, and not every uncomfortable interaction is harmful. But when there is a consistent pattern where you feel drained, unsettled, or less confident after interacting with someone, that is something worth paying attention to. And this is where most people stay stuck. Not because they do not recognize that something feels off, but because they do not step back and look at how often this is happening and what it is doing to them over time. When something becomes familiar, even if it is not healthy, it starts to feel normal. And in that space, it often feels easier to continue adjusting yourself than it does to pause, reflect, and respond differently, especially when the idea of addressing it feels uncomfortable in the moment. For me, the shift did not come from trying to understand the other person better or analyzing why they behaved the way they did, because that only kept me engaged in the same cycle, from turning my attention towards my own response and recognizing how those interactions were affecting me. I started noticing where I was over-adjusting, where I was taking on responsibility that was not mine, and where I was allowing my boundaries to become flexible in order to keep things comfortable. And once I became aware of that, the way I responded began to change. Not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in a more steady and intentional way. I became more conscious of where I invested my energy, more aware of what I chose to engage with, and more clear about not internalizing things that did not align with how I saw myself. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped feeling responsible for managing how others behaved, because that is often where the real exhaustion comes from. If this resonates with you, it may help to start noticing how you feel after interacting with certain people. Not just in the moment, but afterwards, because that is often where the most honest answer shows up. Do you feel clear, calm, and steady? Or do you feel drained, unsettled, or slightly off in a way that is difficult to explain? That awareness is important because it brings your focus back to what you can actually control, which is how you respond, what you allow, and how you choose to engage moving forward. And over time, that shift begins to change the dynamic, not because the other person changes, but because your relationship with the situation changes. If this conversation resonates with you, I would genuinely like to hear your experience, because these situations are more common than we often realize, and sharing perspectives can help bring a deeper level of awareness. If you found this helpful, take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. And if you would like to continue exploring these conversations around self-awareness, leadership, and personal growth, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. In the next video, we are going to explore confidence, not as something that appears instantly, but as something that is built gradually through clarity, consistency, and self-trust, and how that internal foundation begins to change the way you show up across every area of your life. Until then, simply begin to notice how your energy responds to different people, because that awareness often tells you more than the situation itself. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the next video. Be happy and stay inspirited. Bye.